I never expected the man who fixed my leaking faucet to also be the man who would ask me to lie in front of his entire family. I never expected that lie to feel more honest than anything real I'd ever had. It started with a knock on my door at 11 at night, a folded wedding invitation in his trembling hand, and a question I still can't believe I said yes to. He needed a boyfriend for 3 days. I needed rent forgiveness for 2 months. What began as a business arrangement between two strangers turned into something neither of us had the language for, not until the second night in that lake house, when the power went out, and in the dark, he told me the truth about why he'd really asked me. By the time the wedding ended, one of us would have to choose between a family's approval and a love neither of us planned on. But what happened next changed my life forever. The building at 14 Larkspur Row had always smelled like rain, even on dry days, as if the old brick had memorized every storm that ever passed through it. Julian Voss had lived on the 3rd floor for 2 years, in a narrow apartment with a window that looked out over a courtyard of dying ferns. And in all that time, he had spoken to his landlord's son exactly 4 times. Always about something broken. A radiator, a stuck window, a pipe that groaned at 3 in the morning like something in pain. The 5th time was different. It was late October, the kind of evening where the cold arrives all at once, and Julian was standing in his kitchen in socks with a hole in the left heel, illustrating a children's book about a fox who was afraid of the dark, when the knock came. 3 raps, too quick, too nervous to belong to anyone asking about a broken pipe. He opened the door and found Callum Reyes standing there in a coat that didn't match the urgency of his face, holding an envelope so tightly the corners had begun to bend. "I need a favor," Callum said, before Julian could even say hello. "And I know how insane this is going to sound, so I need you to let me finish before you say no." Julian had spoken to Callum only in the language of building maintenance, but he'd noticed him, the way anyone might notice weather. Callum managed his father's properties on weekends, wore his exhaustion like a second jacket, and had a habit of looking at people a half-second too long before looking away, as though he was always deciding something and never quite finishing the decision. He was 29, tall in the way that made doorways feel smaller, with hands that looked like they belonged to someone who built things rather than someone who inherited buildings. "Okay," Julian said carefully. "Finish. My cousin is getting married this weekend. Lake House, 3 hours upstate. The whole extended family will be there." Callum exhaled like the air itself was expensive. "My family doesn't know I'm gay. They think I broke up with my last girlfriend because of my work schedule. My aunt has already texted me the names of 2 women wants to introduce me to at the reception, and my father." He stopped there, jaw tightening around whatever came after that sentence. "My father has a particular idea of what his son is supposed to be. I've spent 6 years managing that idea instead of correcting it, and I can't do it for one more weekend. I can't stand at that wedding and let another woman's hand get held up to me like a solution." Julian said nothing. He recognized the shape of that exhaustion. He'd worn something similar for years before he stopped. "So I need a boyfriend," Callum said, finally getting the sentence out whole. "For 3 days. Someone who can hold my hand at a dinner table and not make it weird. Someone who isn't actually invested in the outcome, so nobody gets hurt when it ends. I have 3 months left on your lease, and I own that decision. I could forgive it. Both months. If you'd consider." He gestured helplessly at the space between them. "This. You're offering to erase my rent," Julian said slowly, "in exchange for me pretending to be your boyfriend at a family wedding. I know how it sounds. It sounds like the setup to a story that ends badly for one of us." Something flickered across Callum's face. Not offense, but recognition, as if Julian had said the exact sentence Callum had been arguing with himself since he'd decided to knock. "Probably," he admitted. "But I'm out of better ideas, and you're the only person I know well enough to ask, and not well enough to owe anything real." That last part landed strangely in Julian's chest, though he couldn't have said why yet. He should have said no. He knew that, standing there in his socks with the hole in the heel, illustration ink still drying on his fingers. He had exactly the kind of life that didn't have room for other people's family dramas. A freelance illustrator's income that fluctuated like weather, a habit of keeping people at the length of an arm, and a wound from 3 years back that had taught him precisely what happened when he let someone matter too much, too fast. His last relationship had ended with a man named Adrian standing in this same doorway, saying that Julian was too much to hold on to, which was a cruelty dressed up as a compliment. and it had taken Julian a long time to stop believing it. But 2 months of rent was real. And there was something in Callum's face, not pleading, exactly, but a kind of raw arithmetic, like a man doing the math on how much of himself he could afford to lose before there was nothing left to protect. Okay, Julian said. Callum blinked. Okay, one condition. I'm not going to be a prop. If I'm doing this, I want to know who I'm supposedly in love with. Real details, not names and dates. The truth, at least between us, even if we're lying to everyone else. Something loosened in Callum's shoulders, like a knot finally given permission to slip. Deal, he said. I can do that. They shook on it in the hallway, which felt absurdly formal for what they were agreeing to, and Julian would think, later, that this was the exact moment the story actually began. Not the wedding, not the lake house, but this handshake between two men who had decided to build something false and had no idea yet how much of it would turn out to be true. The drive upstate took 3 hours, and for the first one, neither of them said much beyond directions and the specifics of the lie. Callum had a folder, an actual folder, tabbed and organized, which told Julian something about the kind of person who managed a family's expectations for a living. Julian's supposed backstory. They'd met at a gallery opening 14 months ago. Julian was an illustrator, which was true, so at least that wouldn't require improvisation. They'd bonded over a mutual dislike of a pretentious sculpture, which was invented, and had been official for 8 months, which required Julian to remember an anniversary that had never happened. Your family's going to ask why they've never heard about me, Julian pointed out, watching the highway dissolve into hills. I told them last week. Said I'd been seeing someone and wanted to see how it went before I said anything. Callum's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. It's not entirely a lie. I have been seeing someone, in the sense that I've been seeing you fix your own radiator badly enough that I had to come back twice. Julian laughed before he could stop himself, and the sound surprised them both, an unguarded thing in a car full of careful lies. By the second hour, the folder was closed and forgotten in the back seat, and they were simply talking. Julian learned that Callum had wanted to be an architect once, had gotten halfway through the degree before his father's stroke pulled him back home to manage the properties, and had never quite found his way back to the version of his life he'd been building. Callum learned that Julian's parents had stopped speaking to him the year he came out, that the fox afraid of the dark in his current book project was, in every way that mattered, a version of himself at 14, and that he illustrated children's books partly because he wanted to give some other scared kid the reassurance nobody had given him. You're not what I expected, Callum said. Somewhere in the third hour, the sky outside gone the color of a healing bruise. What did you expect? Someone who'd make this feel like a transaction. He glanced over, quick, the way he always did. It doesn't feel like one. Julian looked out the window, so Callum wouldn't see whatever his face was doing. Don't get used to that, he said, but it came out softer than he meant it to. The lake house belonged to Callum's aunt, a sprawling structure of dark wood and wide windows that looked like it had been built specifically to photograph well, which, Julian would learn over the weekend, was probably the point. Callum's family arrived in waves. Aunts with opinions, uncles with firm handshakes, cousins already 3 drinks into the celebration before the rehearsal dinner even began. And then there was Callum's father. Desmond Reyes was a compact man with a voice that filled rooms without needing volume, the kind of presence that made conversations quieter when he entered them. He shook Julian's hand once, assessed him the way Julian imagined he assessed a building before deciding whether to buy it, and said, "So you're the one my son's been hiding." "Guilty," Julian said, and something about his own calm surprised him. He'd expected to be terrified. Instead, he felt strangely protective of Callum, of the version of himself he'd agreed to play, of the fragile scaffolding they'd built together in a car for 3 hours. The first night unfolded in careful choreography, Julian's hand finding Callum's under the dinner table when Desmond asked pointed questions about Julian's prospects. Callum's thumb tracing an absent circle against Julian's knuckles that felt less like performance and more like something neither of them had decided to do on purpose. When Callum's cousin asked how they met, Julian told the gallery story flawlessly, and Callum watched him do it with an expression Julian couldn't quite name, something between gratitude and disbelief, as though he was watching a stranger defend him at cost to themselves. Later, on the porch, away from the noise, Callum found him. "You're good at this," he said. "Almost too good. I keep forgetting it's not real." Maybe that's the trick to a good lie, Julian said. You have to believe pieces of it yourself. Callum was quiet for a moment, looking out at the black water of the lake. Which pieces are you believing? Julian didn't answer that. He wasn't ready to know the answer himself. The second night, a storm rolled in off the lake and took the power with it. The house filled with the soft chaos of flashlights and candles, aunts laughing about the last time a storm had ruined a Reyes family wedding, cousins arguing over which drawer held the matches. Julian and Callum ended up on the floor of the guest room they'd been assigned. One bed, which had been its own quiet comedy the night before, both of them too polite to acknowledge how carefully they'd stayed on their own sides, with a single candle between them and rain hammering the windows like something trying to get in. Can I tell you something? Callum said, and his voice had lost its careful weekend polish. In the candlelight, his face looked younger, unguarded in a way Julian hadn't seen yet. The gallery story. It's not entirely made up. Julian frowned. What do you mean? There was a gallery opening. 14 months ago. I was there scouting a building my father wanted to buy next door, and I saw you standing in front of a painting, arguing with yourself about whether you liked it. Out loud. To no one. A small, disbelieving laugh. I never talked to you. I didn't even know your name until you moved into the building 2 months later, and by the time I realized it was the same person, it felt too strange to bring up. So when I needed a story that would hold up under questioning, I used the truth and just added myself into it properly. Julian sat with that for a long moment, the rain filling the silence. You've been carrying that around for over a year? I've been carrying a lot of things around for over a year, Callum said, and there was something in his voice now that sounded like the edge of a confession much larger than the one he'd just made. This weekend wasn't just about my family, Julian. I could have hired an actor. I could have asked a friend from college who already knows about me. I asked you because some stupid, reckless part of me wanted 3 days of pretending something I've wanted to be real since that gallery. The candle between them flickered, throwing shadows that made the room feel smaller, more honest. That's a big thing to say in a blackout, Julian said quietly, when neither of us can see the other person's face clearly enough to know if we mean it. Then let me say it in the morning too, Callum said. When the lights are on and there's nowhere to hide. Julian didn't answer with words. He reached across the small distance between them and found Callum's hand in the dark, threading their fingers together. Not the choreographed gesture from the dinner table, but something quieter, something that belonged only to the two of them and the storm outside. Callum's breath caught, audible even over the rain, and for a long while neither of them said anything else. They simply sat there, hands joined, listening to a house full of a family that didn't know its own son yet, waiting out a storm that had, without either of them planning it, stripped away every careful lie they'd built and left something unbearably real in its place. The twist came the following morning, delivered not by the storm but by Callum's father, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and an expression Julian had learned to read as dangerous. I called the gallery, Desmond said, without preamble, as Julian entered looking for coffee of his own. The one you two supposedly met at. Called yesterday, actually, before the rehearsal dinner. I wanted to send flowers for your anniversary, since apparently you never told your own family it was serious enough to matter. His eyes moved between Julian and the doorway where Callum now stood, frozen. There was no event that matched your story's date. No sculpture exhibit either. I checked. The kitchen went silent except for the rain still ticking off the eaves outside. You've been checking up on my relationship, Callum said, and something in his voice had gone very still, very careful. I've been checking up on my son, Desmond said, because for 6 years you've handed me a life that didn't quite fit together at the seams, and I let it go because I didn't want to know why. But I'm looking at the two of you now, and whatever this actually is, it isn't a lie built out of nothing. I've watched you all weekend. I've watched how he looks at you. He turned to Julian, and for the first time his hard expression cracked into something closer to exhaustion. So which is it? Is my son lying to me about a relationship, or lying to me about the reason he needed one? Callum's hands had curled into fists at his sides, and Julian understood, watching him, that this was the moment. Not the wedding, not the storm, but this kitchen, this coffee going cold, where 6 years of careful management was about to collapse, one way or another. Both, Callum said finally, his voice cracking on the single word. I'm gay, Dad. I have been my whole life. I asked Julian to come this weekend because I couldn't stand at Marcus's wedding for the third time and watch you introduce me to another woman like I was a problem you were trying to solve. I built a lie because I didn't trust you with the truth. And I don't know if I was right not to, because I still don't know what you're going to do with it. Desmond set his coffee down very slowly, and for a long, terrible moment, he said nothing at all, and Julian understood that this silence was the real climax of the weekend. Not a twist manufactured for drama, but the actual unbearable pause between a father and a son who had spent 6 years not saying the truest thing between them. I'm going to ask you a question, Desmond said finally, and I need you to answer it honestly, because I think I already failed to make room for the truth once, and I don't intend to do it twice. He looked at Julian, not unkindly. Is any part of what I watched at that dinner table real? Julian felt Callum's eyes on him, and understood that the answer belonged to him now, that everything hinged on whether he chose the safety of the arrangement they'd built or the frightening, unrehearsed truth of what had actually happened in a car for 3 hours and on a floor for one long night. All of it, Julian said, except the gallery story. I didn't know I mattered to your son until last night, but everything since then has been real. Desmond studied them both for a long moment, and something in his face, the hardness Julian had mistaken for coldness, seemed to give way to something more complicated, grief and relief tangled together. 6 years, he said quietly, mostly to Callum. 6 years I let you carry this alone because I never once made it safe enough to put down. That's on me, not you. He picked his coffee back up, hands not quite steady. I don't know how to do this perfectly. I probably won't. But I'd like to try, if you'll let me. Starting with actually meeting the man you've apparently been in love with since a gallery you never bothered to mention. The wedding itself passed in a blur of relief, so complete it felt almost anticlimactic. Callum's cousin married under string lights strung between the pines, and for the first time all weekend, Callum didn't flinch when his aunt glanced toward Julian, didn't perform a single gesture for an audience that no longer needed convincing. They danced once, badly, laughing at their own missteps. And Julian understood that whatever this was now, it had outgrown the shape they'd built it in. The drive home was quiet in an entirely different way than the drive up had been. Not careful, not rehearsed, just tired and honest and warm. I should tell you, Callum said, somewhere past the halfway point, the rent forgiveness still stands. 2 months. That was the deal. I don't want it, Julian said. Not like that. Not as payment for something that stopped being fake somewhere around a blackout and a bad candle. Callum glanced over, that same half-second too long look, except this time he didn't look away. Then what do you want? Julian thought about the fox in his unfinished illustration, still afraid of the dark on some page in his apartment, still waiting for Julian to figure out how the story ended. He thought about Adrian's voice, years old now, telling him he was too much to hold on to, and how wrong that had turned out to be. He hadn't been too much. He'd simply been waiting for someone with hands big enough to actually try. I want to see what this is, Julian said, without a wedding to hide behind. I want a first date that isn't a performance for your family. I want to find out if the version of us that existed this weekend can survive without an audience. Callum reached over and took his hand, right there on the highway. No dinner table to justify it. No aunt watching to convince. I think, he said, we're about to find out.